Dankeschön, Christoph. Guten Morgen. Ich heiße David. Mein Vorname ist David. Mein Familienname ist Biggs. Ich bin 48 Jahre alt. That's where my German stops. My family and I started last week. It is a real pleasure to be here in München, in Germany, to meet colleagues and friends, students. Especially want to recognize and thank my family, who not only have endured traveling with me in Vietnam many times. Our oldest daughter, Swanan, she's 12, first traveled to the Mekong Delta with us when she was 8 months old. 6 months. Nobody told me that was a problem, and it wasn't. And we've been going all around the world, and life is really wonderful when you can travel with your family. Thanks again to the Rachel Carson Center. This is an incredible, generous opportunity. So I'm really looking forward to sharing the time with you all. And okay. So, start my timer. 25 minutes. So just a few minutes. So this project that I'm working on, it started about 10 years ago. And it started with a conversation. I had led a group, sort of like this group of college students to Hue, Vietnam. Homan and I ran this summer study abroad program. And we were at a 4th of July meeting. The local Vietnamese American Friendship Society hosted us. And those are some of the English-speaking officials, students, and they had a National Day celebration. And I was talking to a man who was the director of the Environment, Science and Technology Department for the province. And he said, "So, you're an environmental historian, eh?" And we talked in English and Vietnamese, and it turned out that the province had to pay about $1 million to clean up a hazardous waste site. And it was a surprise site. It was at the bottom of a reservoir. It was not Agent Orange. It was tear gas in 55-gallon drums. The workers had drained the reservoir. The drums were in the bottom, still in the metal. They began chopping in the metal to take the scrap metal. Scrap metal is valuable. They came in contact with powdered CS or CS2, that's the chemical. They inhaled it. It became airborne. 3 of them died in the hospital with holes inside their esophagus. It's extremely caustic. So this was a big problem. And so I said, yeah, I am an historian. He said, well, it would be really great to find some historic documents about the war to figure out where the rest of these places are, because it's really damn expensive. So I went back to the U.S. archives, and I began looking and trying to figure out what the archives could tell me about these American military base sites in central Vietnam. And I came across these collections. This is a picture, and this was part of an inventory that was done when American troops left the big bases that they were on in 1972. Bob Hope, entertainers, 15,000 troops in amphitheaters, December 1971. February 1972, 2 months later, roughly 1,000 soldiers, a caretaking force, everyone gone. As you can see on the left, most of the buildings are torn down, air conditioners ripped out of buildings, perimeter lighting systems gone, electric generators gone, water treatment plants gone. And the U.S. transferred this property to South Vietnam, a real estate team from the military to theirs, and this is guys on the real estate team for South Vietnam. I don't think he's enjoying his job too much. And they charged him for it. The U.S. said, for all the improvements, the buildings that are left, it's basically sandbags and plywood, this base will cost you about $4 million in an international loan. Have a nice day. The South Vietnamese general wasn't too happy. He had a press conference, but there was nothing to be done. So I like this picture to start the project because it captures this moment of transfer, this moment of transition from one military occupation to another. And when you look at militarized landscapes, one of the things that often you see is that it's impossible to really just isolate one moment of military occupation. Many landscapes have been occupied for decades, if not centuries. So, just very briefly, we found aerial photographs of another base. We found descriptions of the base. This here is an aviation platform. Here is the chemical storage area on that base. Here's a little close-up. You can see where all the barrels are stored here. We don't know what's here. It's a ravine that drains into the water. We characterized the pollution used. These are CS drums of the CS. It was loaded on a helicopter, strapped together and dropped, and then detonated by a jet fighter to create huge clouds of tear gas. That's what it looked like in 2001. You can still see the outlines here of the aviation pads. And that's what it looks like from a motorcycle along the road. And here you can see the edge here of this pad. And so this is one of these hazardous waste sites that I located as part of this activity with the local province. But there are other things in this picture. Here in the back you can see a graveyard. That's a new graveyard. That's the edge of the village hamlet. This is about a 500-year-old village, and their land was taken when the base was created, and they still want it back. So, but not polluted. Here are some new trees. These trees are part of a regreening strategy with exotics from Australia. Plantation forestry is very big. And so I went to these villages to talk to the local people and the local historian to ask them questions about how long had the military been there, how long had this land been degraded. And that's where I began to get an idea for the larger book project. Because these guys scratched their head, they said, I can't tell you, the hills were always bare. Right after the war, for 20 years, eucalyptus wouldn't grow. And now it will, but we know eucalyptus is bad, so we grow acacia. But before that, maybe 200 years, there weren't any trees here. So what I realized in my study, in my travels around this area, was that it's really impossible to just look at one layer of military disruption without, as an historian, without taking into consideration the earlier layers. As it turned out, this base area, it was called Camp Eagle, was a Japanese military base set up in 1941. It was occupied by the French in 1947, by the South Vietnamese, and parts of it that I couldn't ride to are still occupied today by the People's Army. So I've developed some ideas in my larger book project, and one of them is that militarization is a multi-layered process. When you look at military impacts on the environment, it might be worthwhile to think about those earlier layers and how the earlier layers, in some cases, may shape activities that happen later on. This other idea, which I've developed in the book, is this idea that militarized spaces are generative. Which is that when military activity takes place, both on the ground in physical terms and also in terms of representations, maps, land leases, claims to the land, that it often has unintended consequences later on. And that's something I investigated in this project. So the project as a whole is a longer history of this militarized space. And it's an attempt to, in a sense, contextualize the kind of apocalyptic destruction that takes place in the 1960s in a longer history. So in a sense, the agency of military disturbance here is not simply Americans dropping bombs and Agent Orange and other things, but it's the landscape itself shapes the terms in which the Americans encounter this landscape. And also that militarized spaces breed a kind of counter-activity, whether it's illegal burials, there's a lot of that happens, various kinds of trespassing or activity, metal scrap gathering, and of course, lawsuits. As I began studying a history of militarization, a history of military activities in landscape, and began reading, I began looking for earlier discussions. I began to see, too, that militarized landscapes are very central to state building and capital formation. You may be familiar with Schumpeter and this idea of creative destruction. He's an Austrian economist who worked at Harvard. He didn't create that idea. There was actually a German economic historian, Werner Sombart, in 1913, wrote a book called War and Capitalism. And Sombart wasn't the originator of that idea either. He was riffing off of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was riffing off the Indian scriptures. And the idea here is that war creates opportunities by clearing a landscape, by erasing all claims, by bulldozing a landscape. It creates opportunities. And we can even see this in central Vietnam. This is a large combat base, the one I showed you on the first picture. That's what it looked like in about 1969. The base was torn down, but the parcel, the land parcel, stayed the property of the state of Vietnam after 1975. And that's what it looks like today. It's an industrial zone where you once had soldiers, now you have television manufacturing zones. So when we think about militarization, it's important to think about how the sort of political terms of these areas. Okay, so the aim of the book is really not simply to focus on this period. The two chapters focus extensively on the American period, but it's to draw out this longer history of a militarized landscape. And in talking about militarization, I'm adopting a term used by Cynthia Inlow and others, in which we look at processes that are not just physical disturbances, but also cultural and social. And the effects of militarization are seen in various, what I would call flows, in trade, in ideas, in culture, in movement, communication, mapping, especially pollution as it moves through the landscape. I've also selected the term landscape. It's a very important term for me because when we talk about landscape, we're talking about, there's a Landschaft, this idea of a visual perspective. And visual perspective is very important to these various claims. Also, landscape can be both material and imagined or symbolic. And it's a useful term, it's a messy term. And I don't claim to have really totally figured out how I'm using landscape in this project. So I welcome your comments. So for the rest of my talk today, about 15 minutes, I'm going to take you through this long history of this place in central Vietnam. This is the central Vietnamese coast. This is Hue, the former imperial capital. It was set up in 1802. It was a regional capital before that. And these are a couple of these small villages on this main highway, Highway 1, the coastal highway, if you've been to central Vietnam. And I'll specifically be talking about this village, Phu Bai village, and the combat base and airport. If you fly to Hue, you will land here at the Phu Bai airport. So I'm going to talk about that place. And it's really a model study area for a number of reasons. One, it's not currently a conflict zone. Syria would be a model study area. Afghanistan, with the Khyber Pass, would be a model study area for long histories of war, but you can't get there, not easily. It's relatively easy access. Most of it is not currently occupied by the military. And I had support from the local government. That was critical because, as you might imagine, Americans speaking Vietnamese asking about old military base sites without the blessings of the local government might look a little fishy. And yes, I was routinely asked by various local policemen what the hell I was doing. Finally, archives are really critical. And the archives for the Vietnam War are largely open. Largely thanks to the activity of veterans petitioning for those records to be open for health claims and for other works. So my archival work took me to the Vietnamese archives, to Communist Party histories, unit histories, to French military archives, US military archives, and especially using air photography. Because the conflict took place in the 1950s and 1960s, it was sort of at this unique moment in the history of celluloid. Both in film taken on the ground, film taken from airplanes, and even film taken from satellites before scanners were introduced. So, let's talk about it. So, first off, the central region was not only embattled in war in the 20th century, in the late 19th, but we have evidence of conflicts between two ancient kingdoms, Dai Viet, which was founded in 958, it was formerly a Chinese colony, and Champa, which had a series of city ports from the 3rd, 4th century until the 15th century, were rivals, and they fought over this landscape in the middle. They banded together to fight the Mongols, who invaded in 1292. They defeated the Mongols. Not a lot of people can say that, but that gives you a sense of what kind of guerrilla fighters you're working with here. And in the 14th century, the Cham king from a polity here gave the Viet king this little section of land in return for the marriage of the Viet king's daughter to his son. The son died a year later, and the marriage was sort of annulled, and the Cham king wanted his land back, and the Viet king didn't want to give it, so they kept fighting. But this landscape in the middle is a border zone. This is a Cham Hindu tower, which was found in a sand dune off the coast of Hue in 2005. And so in a place like Hue, if you dig down a few feet underground, you'll run into ruins of some kind, either Viet or Cham or Chinese. This is a picture of one of these mountain passes. So this land is sort of bordered on the end and on the top here by these mountain passes that run out to the sea. And these became kind of effective border areas between these ancient kingdoms. So, in first looking at the Vietnamese history, sort of this early modern history, what I found was that, and this is the airport site right here, Phu Bai Airport, was that it wasn't just occupied by military troops in the 1960s, it was occupied by Lei Dynasty troops in the 1400s. They had a military barracks basically next to the runway where U.S. Marines were in 1966. So I began studying the early history of this region and these villages. These are village boundaries, commune boundaries. And what I found was that the coastline, this inner coastline, was a kind of strategic beachhead for Vietnamese families moving south. They were loyal veterans of the Vietnamese army. They were given concessions in villages that had probably been inhabited since the 3rd century BC. So they were Cham villages. They were given land title. They probably married local Cham women, had mixed families, and they began to found those villages. And those founding ancestors are still very important in these little villages that form here along this inner coastline. This particular village, Phu Bai, was important, and all of these villages, you see that they're straddling an area. The green area is estuary, that's basically sea level. The white area is from 3 meters to about 150 meters, those are hills. And every village had a piece of hills and a piece of estuary. It was very important for the early modern economy, because the estuary provided what? Rice and fish, food. And so settlers got plots of land up here, but the hills were equally important in this early modern period. The way the Vietnamese took this land from Champa was through military force. The way they acquired superior military technology was by defeating the Ming army, Ming China, in 1427, using firearms, using cannons, using artillery shells. All of these things required metal. And Vietnamese improved on the metal technology from the Ming in order to defeat them as a guerrilla army, and then they turned it south on their southern neighbors. They defeated Champa in 1470. So Phu Bai was famous in part because it had iron in the hills. And so this village was exempted from military conscripts. The children of the village did not have to join the military. They only had to work in 10 times more deadly iron mines. And if they didn't work in the iron mines, they worked in the smelters. They smelted iron from roughly 1600 to the end of the 1700s. All through the rainy winter, day and night, they kept the smelters running with charcoal. They produced 60 tons of iron per year for the government. Another 30 tons for commercial trade. 60 tons per year produces somewhere in the order of 200 tons of slag per year. That's the waste product. One ton of iron requires somewhere around 6 or 7 tons of charcoal, which requires 3 or 4 times as much wood. Which meant that this village was consuming all of the available forest around it to produce this charcoal until it basically exhausted it. So what we see in this early modern period in this central coast near the government town is this idea that John Richards and other people talk about in sort of an early modern environmental collapse, and that the hills around here were largely barren by the 1700s. And this created a bit of an eco-political crisis. We see civil war from this period, a 50-year civil war. And by the end of the 1700s, local government records say that over 40% of the hills are bare, idle wasteland. Nevertheless, the government is claiming taxes from the local inhabitants, saying you still have to pay your taxes, or if you don't pay your taxes, you can join the army. And so you see rebellions. So this early period of industrialization and waste landing in these hills produces a situation that is ideal for colonial military cartographers in the late 1800s. One man is one of the first Frenchmen to travel this road from Da Nang, where there are a few French boats, over the mountains up to Hue. And when he travels through this area right in here, he remarks on these beautiful sloping hills, ideal for cash crops. He doesn't talk about the severe erosion, the fact that there's no topsoil. He's trying to sell this to the French government and the French public. And in the book where he writes about this place in the Central Coast and talks about acclimatization, he also says that, of course, the reason the hills are bare is due to the laziness of the Vietnamese and their pitiful government. Right? He's a booster for colonial occupation. So the colonial government takes over, and these wasteland areas become the property of the colonial government. The village, with its dense fields and households, is private. That stays Vietnamese. But this land becomes public. However, the colonial government is not able to simply erase everything that is there. It tries to sell this land off to entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs are, for the most part, not interested. It's wasteland. Furthermore, there are existing uses like an artillery firing zone and village tombs and graves, which the landowner cannot disturb. So even in this colonial period, not a lot happens until the aftermath of World War I. After World War I, France has a surplus of airplanes. It doesn't need them in the war zone in France, so it sends them to the colonies, which requires airfields. And this is where we see the beginning of the Fleury airfield as a wasteland, is a perfect place to put a runway. So on the slag heaps of the old iron smelting area, toxic waste, perfect place to make a nice dirt runway. Also, a socialist governor of Indochina says, well, it would also be nice to do something for lepers. Leprosy was a big problem, communicable diseases. So they put a leper colony in this area as well. The colonial military needed money to keep the planes up. They didn't really have anything to do, so they sold postcards. And this is one picture postcard from the 1930s of one of these biplanes over Hue. But the production of aerial photography had an unintended consequence, which was it raised awareness of the extent of environmental degradation in the colony, which led the French colonial government to sort of come up with a number of strategies for reforestation. They didn't get very far, though, before Japan invaded in 1941. They expanded an air base. They put a POW camp on the highway. And they located an ammo depot in the hills. Oops. Okay. Wrap it up. Oops. There. Okay. So this moment in 1945 is really the beginning of the sort of modern militarization of this landscape. The Viet Minh, the communist-led Viet Minh, take over in 1945. Contrary to popular belief, it was an urban-based organization. They had officers from the former French military that helped them move into these base areas. They were the original occupants. After the peacekeeping arrangements were made, the Chinese Nationalist Army moved into this area, and in 1947 the Chinese and the French cut a deal, so French troops came back here. So, from 1947, the base expands. And this is where we get into this modern period. The French did not draft for the Indochina War. They paid, they recruited former Nazi soldiers, French African soldiers, anybody they could pay who would go. Not a lot of French people went. So this base had Senegalese and Moroccan soldiers protecting it. On the edge, they put a camp for the Moroccan soldiers. They named it Camp Oasis. But the French maps showed that all of that area was Viet Minh controlled, all the way almost down to the highway. And we have evidence of Viet Minh pamphlets in Arab and in French to these Moroccan soldiers saying, we are fighting a jihad against colonialism just like you in Morocco. So join us and, go home. So the war ends and base construction continues. By 1963, U.S. aid to South Vietnam has extended the runway, created a radio spying base from the National Security Agency, an artillery post, and most importantly, an officer training school to build up the South Vietnamese military. Even in 1963, however, the security assessment of this area is that the Viet Minh control all of the hills almost down to the highway. Bernard Fall called this the street without joy. for routine ambushes on them. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. Marines come here, the U.S. Marines come in 1965. They come to Fubai in particular, and a number of other air bases to run security around these air bases. And this is a really unique moment, because we have this idea that military actors are just blowing things up, completely ignorant about the local communities, the local environment. And if you actually read their records, that's not always the case, especially in the very beginning. This man, Paul Eck, here, he was a Special Forces, Navy Special Forces soldier, a volunteer. And he volunteered to join a unique group called a Combined Action Company, in which American soldiers would live with Vietnamese soldiers and try to understand this historic landscape. And the Marines even changed their name from the 3rd Expeditionary Force, which conjures an idea of conquering the land, to the 3rd Amphibious Force. And I think this word amphibious is really interesting, because you're sort of halfway in, halfway out. And I think that beautifully describes this idea. So this is Paul Eck's own words, in which they tried to get the people to accept them as members of the community. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, imagine that. And then they wanted to learn as much as they could about Vietnam and the people, so they could live with them in a close relationship, not as an occupational force, but as members of that village. At the same time, carrying out the primary mission of a military capability. This idea lasted for 6 months. After enough suicide bombings and attacks, the Marines responded in force. They responded with one of the largest military construction efforts in the history of warfare. They built base cities around Vietnam. And they built it all with congressional approval. The Senate voted 98-2 in 1966 to build up base cities. So this is what Fubai looked like after 6 years of base construction. On the left was that base that we saw at the very beginning, with 5 helipads having about 15,000 troops. On the right was the air base with 10,000 troops and a jet runway. Expanded ammo chemical dumps. So these are some visual records of the consequences of that buildup. This is a map. The Department of Defense has free public databases of every bombing mission taken in Indochina. And this is a map of bombs dropped in just 2 years, 1968-69, 370,000 plus tons. These are records of defoliation spraying missions in the province, and that's some work that I've been doing lately. And that's what those spraying missions look like up close. This is a mountain town, Khe on the headwaters of one of the main rivers. This was a Viet Minh stronghold, an abandoned U.S. Special Forces base, and as you can see, the entire commune was covered in Agent Orange. Okay. So what happens when the military leaves in 1975? The People's Army takes over, but there's really no need for all these parcels of land. In 1980, that scene you see here that's the picture. And I find this moment after the war, I think one of the most poignant in my study. I talked to people in that village in Hamlet 5, and this man, Mr. Phuong, he talked about it, and he was a veteran. He'd fought with the NLF, and he said that they cleared the hills so that several years later there was nothing left. At that time, I looked out from this spot on the hill. Out here it was like New York City, bright lights like crazy. But then they cleared out after several years and left it empty. They managed it so nobody could take anything. They took it with them. I returned here and just farmed. My house then was an iron siding house. He'd taken some of the iron siding from the hangars to make his house. At that time, I resolved to preserve one military tank as a reminder. But then I went to Hanoi to study, and the people here, they took it for scrap. They cut it up. Can you imagine cutting up a tank with hand tools? I intended to preserve the American base in Hamlet 5 because I lived near here. I knew to preserve it so that later our children and people could come and visit. But they'd taken and broken up everything. The stuff the Americans had left was all destroyed. I only took some Ironside. That was it. Right? So there is this tension, and I think this tension this is a global problem of what to do with a former military waste area. Do you preserve it, or do you replace it? Do you build on top of it? Do you forget about it? What parts do you remember? This is a very political and delicate issue. And it's not only Vietnamese. In 1983, a New York Times reporter, a former war correspondent, came back to this area when he flew into Hue. And he said there was nothing left, just a few stones. But a U.S. veteran in a letter to the editor responded, and he said, "I must respectfully disagree with this observation that only stones were left where American bases had stood. As a former non-commissioned officer in the 101st, who spent a short but incredibly intense part of my life at Phu Bai and Camp Eagle, I know with certainty that more is left there than a few stones. Things like honor and comradeship, our former naivete, and the blood of ourselves and others in the sand. For those of us who fought there, Phu Bai and Camp Eagle remain something indelible, a place in our minds and memories, not just places on a map." So, I'll stop here, but this idea that I'm trying to convey in my book about this militarized landscape is both that militarization is not just one moment or one favorite war, but we should try to understand it as a layered experience, and we should also be sensitive to the kind of continuing politics in these places. I, for one, think that an historic approach is a useful way to inform those debates. Thank you.